You have recently written an article for the Intercept. Despite huge number of misconduct complaints, cops at NYPD's 75th Precinct keep getting promotions. You have also covered another precinct. NYPD's culture of impunity sees an officer repeatedly accused of physical and sexual abuse rising through the ranks. Here is a passage from the first article. An Intercept analysis cross-referencing CAP stat salary data with CCRB complaint shows that this was a widespread pattern at the 75th Precinct. Rather than being punished, when civilian complaints of misconduct against them were substantiated, police at the 75th routinely got promotions and raises. How do you explain this?
Well, due to a lot of sort of both US and New York city specific political forces, NYPD police basically, like, there's no instrument of accountability. It's partly because the police unions in New York are really, really strong, as they are across the country, but New York is especially egregious. And then, which by the way, I'm pro-union, but in the US, the police unions serve a completely different function than like teachers unions do. So that's part of it. A lot of the leadership, including New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio, are sort of scared to challenge the police. And the only regulatory tool is the Civilian Complaint Review Board. And it's that, because, you know, I know it's such a good idea in theory, like basically civilians lodge a complaint with this agency, they investigate it, and then they recommend, well, first they find out if there's like evidence that the police misconduct occurred, then they recommend disciplinary action, but the disciplinary action is ultimately up to the NYPD and the police commissioner. And in almost zero cases do they take the advice of the CCRB. So this poor regulatory body, like they have to go through all this work and investigate all this stuff. And then they're like, okay, we discovered that like Officer X, Y, and Z sexually assaults teenagers or whatever. We recommend termination. And then the NYPD is like, nope, he gets raised. So that's, I mean, I hope that's not, does that make sense? Is that too in the weeds?
But how do you explain that they get a raise and a promotion, not just that they don't get punished? You have explained it, but why a raise?
So it's not like they actively get rewarded for bad behavior. It's just that, like, they're not like, oh, you inappropriately did a strip search, here's a raise, obviously. But just because of the union contracts and NYPD and city policy, I think officers get automatically promoted every few years based on like a set schedule. And that happens regardless of whether they commit egregious abuses or not. In fact, I can't confirm this. So maybe I would suspect that, because like the most serious allegations of misconduct aren't the like street patrol rank and file, like early career officers who tend to be younger, but the older detectives, because they have more power, they're less likely to get fired, they probably have relationships with prosecutors. So there's this thing in American popular culture where like TV shows like Law and Order, they show the detectives as like the good guys, like, right? The ones that like solve serious crimes like rape and murder. And then the kind of like the low class, like beat cops that are in uniform are kind of presented as like a little bit low class, right? You know, they have the accents, they're never like the hero for the most part of the TV show or the movie. But so I was actually kind of shocked when I started looking at the data that the most serious misconduct charges are against high level, like powerful detectives.
In your Intercept articles, you point to the data for different areas of New York, and in the wealthier areas, there were fewer complaints. Is there a mindset that, in those less wealthy areas, it's appropriate, it's okay, even it's the right thing to do to treat people harshly, to beat them up?
You mean to prevent crime or serious crime?
Yes, or because the officers or detectives believe these people are dangerous, so because of racism or
Yes.
arrogance.
I mean, I think that's probably what they tell themselves, but A, that's wildly unconstitutional. And B, I would say the main issue is that, a lot of times people think that, that like these neighborhoods with like super serious crimes, like there's so many cops there because those cops are busting people for the serious crimes. But what you see a lot of is cops framing people, and not even framing people for serious crimes. Like you see cops, like, some kid will like throw a cigarette on the sidewalk and the police will say, well, it was marijuana, and then drag him in or arrest him. He has to like go to multiple court appearances, which is very not ruining, but like very destabilizing. And then usually what you see is that the charges are thrown out because A, the crime didn't happen, B, it wasn't a serious crime. I mean, in New York, you are allowed to have small amounts of marijuana on you. So I'm just gonna say that yes, due to a million different factors, some parts of the city that tend to be poorer have higher rates of crime than richer parts of the city. But like the primary strategies used by police to allegedly try and prevent those serious crimes involve like a massive amount of either framing people or busting people for completely nonviolent crimes. Like we're talking about like they see somebody standing on the sidewalk and they're like, why are you loitering? And the guy's like, actually, I live here. I'm allowed to stand on the sidewalk. And they like bust his head open, drag him in and say, like, oh, you resisted arrest and stuff like that. So, I mean, if you were like an extremely cynical person, you could say that those tactics are worth it to maintain some kind of like totalitarian control in those areas, so that authoritarian probably control in those areas so that they don't like spin out of control. But in terms of crime, but there's not evidence I've seen that really aggressive policing of low-level crimes decreases violent crime, even though a lot of US police strategy has revolved around that concept, that very unproven concept. And yeah, like it's not like all those cops who have all these complaints against them were like, they roughed up a murderer. Like, no, they roughed up a 16-year-old teenager because they needed to drag somebody in to fill their quota, and the kid had a cigarette, and they framed him for pot. I guess. First of all, I don't think they've ever admitted to having quotas. Then at some point when it was like completely obvious that they had quotas, they said they would stop whatever they were doing that could be seen as quotas. I mean, even if there's not like an official quota system that's like public, like police are incentivized to make arrests and pull people in. Like otherwise, what are they doing? And also another huge incentive is for them to make overtime, because overtime money in New York City pays exceedingly well. And it's like, they're not going to get paid overtime to just like sit in the car and do nothing. So there's that. I mean, I'm sorry that I don't know the exact answer to this. I can't tell you if there's like an literal concrete quota system, but whatever is there it's something that encourages police to bust like multiple people for nonviolent crimes in only some neighborhoods. Because like I'm actually in Park Slope right now, which is like a very, very nice neighborhood in New York. And I can tell you that you see people smoking pot in the park, people like publicly drinking in the park. Cops are not busting those people for public drinking and publicly smoking weed. Like I can guarantee they're not.